Welcome to the session where we were talking about the burning trends in higher education. I'm Ian Wilhelm. I'm a deputy managing editor at the Chronicle. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Goldie Blumenstyk.
Hi, Ian.
How are you? And that was, by the way, that was Goldie's choice for her walk-on music. Just to be clear, that's because she says she's a Jersey girl. She had to have the boss. So, and of course, this is Nancy Gonzales, the provost at Arizona State University. Nancy, thanks for being here. So the plan for today was to talk about the Chronicle's latest issue of the Trends Report. We're not going to do that. Nancy had a fun idea that, Nancy, I'd love for you to introduce and to say we're going to change things up a little bit today.
Yeah, we're gonna turn the tables a bit here. So in August of this past year, Goldie made the announcement that she would be stepping down and retiring. And you know, if you're in higher education or higher education adjacent, you know, the Chronicle and the Edge, the newsletter from the Chronicle, are part of your regular feed. We're always used to hearing what Goldie has to say about trends in higher education, about the issues, and sort of relying on her reporting. And so she's now stepped down, so we thought it's time for us to interview her instead of the typical role that she plays. So we're excited to be able to do that, and it's a good time to have Goldie reflect on where we are in higher education once again. So first of all, Goldie, congratulations on retirement.
Thanks very much. Thank you, everybody. That's really nice.
Curious, has all of what's happened since you announced in August changed your mind?
No. I've been a reporter for 44 years, 36 years at the Chronicle, and 8 years before that at the Orlando Sentinel. And I actually don't know that I have the stomach to do right now what needs to be done in reporting on higher education right now. So, I mean, I'm watching carefully, and I'm not enjoying very much of what I see, but I don't know that I want to come back to it right now.
Well, we'll get into some of that. Before we do, I'm curious to have you mentioned in your article when you announced that you would be stepping out, that you were going to keep your hands in it. So tell us what that means.
I mean, it means basically showing up at events like this. I was at a few other convenings in the last year. I mean, and sort of staying in touch with some of the issues that really mattered to me the most. Over time, opportunities for adult and parent students to continue to go to college, making sure, actually thinking a little bit about this moment in higher education, even pre the political change. Higher ed is sort of at this was already at this inflection point with the expansionist era ending and sort of this new era of contraction and constraint, and watching how the business models and the financial models evolve. So issues like that, and also, frankly, I've always been very interested in the role higher education plays in fostering the best ideals of American democracy, the best ideals of American pluralism. So those are the issues, primarily the ones that I've been following, or intend to keep following, the ones I care about the most.
So let's talk a little bit about this. You mentioned, that you saw a lot of this emerging, and so the crisis that we're facing now is in some ways, it's not entirely new, and you've been through a lot of crises in your nearly 4 decades doing this. So tell us, do you see this moment, whether you call it a moment or existential kind of crisis or whatever terminology we're using, do you see this as just a continuation of where we were, or is this something different that we're seeing?
If you had asked me this question in January, I would have said this was the culmination of a lot of trends that we'd been seeing over time. Obviously, been a lot of ups and downs over the years. We've had, we had the recession in the 90s. We had the Great Recession in 2007. We had, and then we had, of course, COVID. And I thought all of those were pretty tumultuous events in higher education. This other thing that had been building, what I call sort of the end of the expansionist era, that's been sort of a 10-year thing, fueled by things that colleges have done, fueled by the demographic cliffs that are coming. And I thought that was sort of a slow-moving, terrible set of trends affecting higher education. But I think what's happening right now in the political environment, frankly, I'm a little freer to say some of this now that I've retired, I think it's a very scary and dangerous time for American higher education. And I think the threats that we're seeing coming out of this new administration, and in some cases, enabled by Congress, by their action and by, frankly, their inaction, could fundamentally undermine a lot of what America has counted on as an engine of opportunity, as an engine of stability, and an engine of economic growth, it could be devastated in a few months.
I want to get into some of those issues specifically that the administration has put at the forefront to higher education, but I also want to ask you about what underpins it potentially when it comes to the public sentiment about higher education and the concerns that is talked quite a bit about at Summit, which is the ROI, the concern that basically that the degree does not pay off, it costs too much, and too many Americans and American families feel like it is not worth it.
All that's real. I heard Michael Crow yesterday say, there's grass fires. There's a grass fire out there, and grass fires can rage really fast and overtake you very fast. And certainly, I think higher education helped dry out the grass over the years. I don't know how to carry this analogy too far. We'll just stop it with that. There's a lot of things that higher ed has done clumsily or wrong over the last 10, 20 years. I think the ROI conversation is one of the best examples of that. They let the higher education, they let the debate of higher education become very reductive. I still remember very early on people were talking about get that college degree and you'll earn $1 million more. Well, I think that was a great argument. It sounded like a really great argument at the time, but I think over time it's the one that's kind of come back and bit higher ed in the behind. There's a lot of other transfers too hard. It's really hard. The college became really unaffordable for a lot of people, and certainly there's a lot of ways higher education sort of like I said, let the grass get dried out. But something else is happening right now, which is a little scarier. And this is not a threat of lightning now suddenly coming. This is sort of somebody lighting a match. But I'm not saying higher education is blameless. The industry, the sector, got a little alienated from a lot of the population. So that's a problem. But I don't think that's what we're facing right now.
So in terms of that, all of that and what you see as we move forward, I know a lot of people are sort of trying to figure out how we navigate this and how we both, see the real threats, as you said, and you've outlined some of those threats, but also see how we need to move forward in a productive way, how one does that. You've seen a lot of responses in higher education at other moments of crises, so what do you think the higher education sector response should be?
More than what we've been seeing so far. But before I say that, I want to think about something else because it's not that dark in here. I can see a lot of you. How many people in the room are kind of from the business side of higher education? Not necessarily at an institution, but at a company or a vendor who does business with higher ed. Okay, not that many. I wish there were more of them in the room because I guess what I would say right now is after watching, this might get me thrown out of GSV, I don't know. After watching the government, and just in the last few months, withhold grants from universities because they disagree with the role of what a governor said. After watching the government attempt to cancel contractually agreed upon overhead rates between universities. After watching the government revoking international students' visas, including some from our host institution here today. After watching the government decimate the NIH and the NSF and all the other organizations that are going to provide not only the cures for cancer for our families, but also create the scientific pipeline for our future. After watching all that, I've been sitting here wondering, frankly, thinking about all the companies that have been coming to GSV since even before I started coming here in 2013, how many billions of dollars these industries have made off the backs of higher education and off the backs of students. Where are you? I mean, you're in the room, so you're all here, but like, where are these companies right now? This sector is being attacked in ideological ways, not legally, and not really on policy issues, but sort of for reasons that are not logical, in my opinion, but I think in many people's opinions. Well, where is the industry here? Why aren't the industry that sort of has got itself rich off this sector for so many years, where is that industry right now? I have not seen op-eds from companies. I have not seen I've seen op-eds from other kinds of organizations supporting higher education. I have not, maybe I missed it, and if I did miss it, I apologize. But I have not seen the higher education industry, the business sector, respond at all. These are your customers, these are your clients, these are your, these are also the institutions that provide you the intellectual capital for your own companies. Where are they? I don't know where they are. And I'm I feel awful. After coming to this meeting for so many years, I feel awful to know that the silence is so great.
Goldie, you had a quote you said to me a couple weeks ago that there may be some folks who say, hey, for this take the dismantling of the education department. We heard from Linda McMahon this morning, the secretary, a little bit about what they're keeping, what they may not keep. But there is concern that there is some folks who may say, hold it, we've been long advocating for a different approach here. We've been long advocating for a clean slate, perhaps even a disruption. But as you said to me, this is not disruption, this is destruction.
This is destruction.
And so how would you sort of think about those two different things? Yes, I think a lot of people at this conference want this type of disruption because we know that students are not being served in the way that we want them to. There are outliers here for sure. But on the other hand, what you're seeing here is maybe something different than just saying, hey, we're cleaning slate in order to do better.
If you think transfer is screwed up in this country, I do. I think transfer is really poorly done. Why would you cut grants that are now studying the problems with transfer and ways to improve it? That's what they just did with the IES grants, and destroying that sector. There is such taking down. I know there are probably people out there, maybe not in this room apparently, but there are probably people out there who think this is great. We'll just start with a clean slate. It sounds really nice, except the reality is you cannot always build back after a destructive force like this. You lose expertise, you lose time, you lose money. By the way, you also waste a lot of money because you're throwing out a lot of stuff that's already 3/4 done, and so it's not even fake. The ostensible efficiency of this is not even real. So I just don't get it, honestly. I think the sector there needs to be a lot of prodding on this sector and a lot of pushing and but the way to do it is to not just basically tear it down. I don't know, well, maybe some people think that. Personally, I don't want to, I've reported on higher education for a long time. I started as a state reporter at the Chronicle in 1988. One of the first things I learned by covering all these various states was how much states, Republican and Democratic states, were relying on their educational systems to build their economies. Not just the higher ed sector, but all their economies. So whatever was wrong with the systems, maybe transfer is broken, a lot of the adult students don't get served as well as they could be. There's a lot of things I could identify that are wrong with this thing, but why would you want to just destroy the very thing that builds your economy, that creates your future? I don't get it.
So, yes, thank you for that very much. And
I should
Goldie
say,
promised that we would get Goldie uncensored. Yeah. But the truth is, I don't know that she ever has been censored.
And believe me, I'm not sitting here trying to be an apologist for the education department. They frustrated the hell out of me when I was a reporter. I'd filed FOIA requests, and 2 years later, I'd get back my information on a CD-ROM. We couldn't even find a CD-ROM in the office to play the data. But again, that's not necessarily even all their fault, because I'm sure they would have rather given it to me in a little disk. They didn't have the technology to do that kind of stuff. But let's not fool ourselves. If you cut half the education department, you're not going to be able to do all the things that you're constitutionally required to do, even if you think some of these things were woke or silly or whatever. You can't have 3 people in IAS do the job that hundreds of people did before. The federal student financial aid system, if you want students to be able to go to college, they need to be able to get their Title IV grants, and they need to be able to get their student loans. And they also need to be able to get their student loans serviced after they graduate. You cannot decimate these offices and then pretend you're still going to have an operating American higher education system. It sounds great for them. Oh, we're cutting costs. That's not working. That's not going to work. It's going to be broken.
So, yes, and I think that there's also a need for those of us in positions where we have to keep moving forward to look for ways to position ourselves to be part of the building, because we can't give up on the promise of higher education, and look for those things that we all need to be doing to position ourselves. So, for example, that we don't discourage the whole next generation of scientists from coming into the universities.
I don't know how you're going to do that. I think it's like it's vitally important, and I had admiration every single day for all the people who are working in higher education right now, who are still trying to encourage young people and older people, because I always want to remember the older students who are in college, that there is a future coming forward. But I think your challenge has now been made 10 times harder than it was last week or 2 weeks ago or 6 months ago. But because we still need scientists, we still need people who can study the climate. By the way, the climate change, just because you say climate change isn't happening, it's still going to happen, with whether you want to say it or not. How do you think about it, Nancy?
Well, I think that we do still need all of that, and we need the solution to the transfer problem, and we need the solution to students who felt left behind and not included, and that means all students, and we need to find a way to keep moving forward with building a better society. So for me, we need to stay focused on those things and positioning ourselves. And I think we're in the middle of a huge storm, and you know, the fire hasn't completely decimated the entire territory. We have to keep trying to work to build and with what we have, and kind of figure out what is it we all need to do to move forward. And maybe one thing, and there's no doubt, I mean, bad things are happening, and we're in a really dark time. But again, we need to be looking to the future, and I think that's actually one of the things that GSV is all about, is designing a better future, and you know, very much focused on technology. So you know, I think we can't lose sight of the fact that that's also part of what we need to be doing. You also mentioned another part of what got us here, the conditions that dried out the grass, and you know, being the public sentiment, and you're a communicator. So I'm curious about what can we do better about communicating the value of higher education? How are we telling our stories or not telling our stories in ways that we can connect with our communities?
This was a baffling one for me. And I was actually thinking about it in the same context, because I feel like right now, higher ed and government writ large kind of have the same problem, because I think only now are people in the government and people in the population realizing, oh yeah, Social Security, I do care about that. Oh yeah, cancer research, I do care about that. And so people didn't always necessarily understand what all the places that government touched them, and I don't think people always necessarily understand all the places that higher education has an impact. And I think in a way this is it's a challenging time, because this is a kind of a local story. Everybody needs to kind of tell this story in their own community, in their own ways. That's the advice I often hear about, you know, but there are fewer ways to tell that story locally, because there are, sadly, fewer news organizations locally that can do that. But we do have other media, we have social media, we have there are other tools to reach people right now, and they're not as, they're a lot more siloed, I guess, and they're not as mainstream as before, but so you have to almost do it through social media. You have to, not necessarily meta, but you have to make the connections. And the part, there are alumni bases. I mean, all these universities have alumni bases, and they have community connections, and you have great connections. Obviously, you've got connections all over your state and other states where you operate. I think you have to use those networks in ways that, like before you were using those networks maybe to draw in resources, and now you have to maybe reverse the role of those networks and use them to communicate outward to yourselves, and not in a kind of a propaganda sort of like alumni magazine sort of, you know, rah-rah way, but I think there has to be just a lot more direct communication. It's harder today than it would have been even 20 years ago to do that, because just the media landscape has changed so dramatically also. I mean, it's also the government's problem. It's harder for that message to get communicated back out, because the media landscape is so fragmented. But it's not, universities, I mean, it's sort of funny to me as I think about it, because in DC, people talk a lot about, the power of the higher ed lobby. Well, like right now, number one, we're not really seeing so much power on the higher ed lobby. It seems to be really kind of fragmented. But also the power of colleges, and as fundraisers, like, you know this from covering philanthropy, everyone always talked about how, you know, people were sort of jealous of colleges because they had this like innate base of support, you know. It was easier to be a college fundraiser than to be a fundraiser for a lot of other kinds of organizations. I think now colleges have to sort of turn back to those networks.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be very curious about that, if they can find ways to connect and make their story known locally, as you said. And I do think that makes a lot of sense, so I'm also curious about the the ability to speak with one voice nationally. I think this is one of those easy things I think we talk about in the Chronicle office. Why doesn't higher education come together and talk with more of one voice? Well, because it's diverse,
Right.
because it has lots of different segments to it, and that's its power, that's its potential, that's its what makes it one of the best systems in the country, though it's not really a system, even though we use that word. But I am curious about, do you feel like that there could be a moment here where there's more of a central voice, and do you think that's coming from some of the associations? Because as we've covered, we have seen the associations really step up, it seemingly.
In a big way.
ACE, I just give them credit. I think they're out there in a way talking and about to their constituents also filing onto a lawsuit, which we've never really seen before. So I do think there is some movement here to have something of a collective voice, if from the associations working together perhaps on this issue.
I think that's going to be crucial. I'm thinking a little bit about the way that some law firms have and have not responded to the attacks on the law firms. I think there's now more than 400 law firms that have signed on to the friend of the court brief for that law firm Perkins Coie that the administration has kind of targeted them primarily because they don't like who they're representing, which feels very un-American to me. But I feel like in some way that I was proud to sort of see that that there were a lot of law firms responding. Unfortunately, a few weren't. Actually, one of the bigger law firms that has joined one of these coalitions is Cooley, which I know is a major sponsor here. I'm not here shouting out sponsors, but it just happened to notice that, and a lot of us have gone on that ship every year, so I thought I would mention that. It's been really striking to me, though, not just ACE did that lawsuit on federal grants and the overhead rates, but also IHEP and just sued the government over the attacks on the NCI and under the IES attacks. So we're starting to see a little bit more of that association. I mean, as we pointed out in that trends report that's now on the ground there, there's a little danger in that too, because there are ways that the government can try to use the antitrust laws against higher education when they start to believe that they're acting in a cartel or something like that. So schools have to be kind of careful about it, but I think associations are sort of, or maybe other kinds of coalitions of cause are probably the appropriate way to do that.
So the trends report is there on the ground.
It's not like we don't love it.
It's still worth reading.
It's really worth reading, and Ian can tell you how to get a copy of that.
So what do you want us to know about the trends report that it becomes maybe even more important for us to know in this moment, given what's happened, since that came out?
Well, there's a few fundamental things in there that are still really important. We talk about the growth in online education. It's now more than half of all students are now taking at least one online course, and that growth has kind of picked up since, there was a COVID wave, but then the wave has kind of continued, and that's accelerated. Another interesting trend in that report, which is, again, a plus and minus for higher ed at this moment, probably a little bit more of a minus, is just sort of what they call it, the Cold War between the faculty and the administration. And unfortunately, that's been building for a long time too, and this is a really bad time to have that kind of tension on campuses. Probably would be much better if there was a lot more coalescence between those two organizations, those two sectors. But frankly, those sectors have never loved each other. It's always that tension's been growing for a while, and I think there's two other trends in there that are kind of not of this moment, but they're just kind of interesting to me. One is kind of about, the two of them are sort of about sports. One is about sports betting, the rise of sports betting, especially among college men, and the other one is kind of about sort of the coming financialization, maybe is the right word for it. All the money now sort of in intercollegiate athletics with the name and likeness and image stuff. Just sort of, it's just an ironic thing at the same time, because college sports still kind of stands over here. Money, energy, attention, good attention, bad attention. College sports doesn't seem to get much harmed by everything else that's going on at the same time. There's a lot of attacks on higher education for ideological reasons, for what I consider maybe some spurious concern, some real concerns, and then some spurious concerns about anti-Semitism on campus. Meanwhile, this whole other sector of higher education, of the big-time athletics, just kind of grows and doesn't really get affected by the conversation, which I think is kind of curious.
Yeah, it's an interesting time. We've got, rapid acceleration of innovations and technologies. At the same time, we've got all the disruptions that we're talking about here today, and then all the disruptions and changes in athletics all at once. So
Yeah.
there's a lot coming at us all at once. It sort of really seems like a period of, redesign is needed.
But there's something, but like last night, I'm sure those basketball games have gotten really high ratings. People aren't hating on that, right? So everyone hates higher education supposedly, but they're still watching the games. Yeah.
Oh, I was going to reflect on that. I've got my my nephew who's going to Alabama starting in the fall, and I've reminded my mother-in-law, who is very excited about this aspect, and he's certainly excited about the sports. And I would say, hey, don't forget that the biomedical research center is also under fire for its great research, and there's just sort of this complete disconnect, right? They don't see that side of things, but they're excited because the Crimson Tide is doing great,
I have friends whose kids are going to college next year, and they asked me, it's actually not my expertise, this college admissions thing. I kind of know about college at the other level, not at the admissions side. But suddenly I found myself actually saying, well, that's a big research university. You might want to consider whether it's going to be under extra financial stress next year or the next several years because of that, and maybe that should weigh in your decision. Sorry, Nancy. But that's a factor. I kind of want to go back to something. I'm not so sure you asked me about it explicitly, but I've just been thinking about it as I'm just thinking about your school in particular. And we're talking about like what schools need to do. I remember visiting Arizona State a couple years ago, and while on a reporting trip, sitting in the cafeteria and watching this whole group of students come in. They were on some kind of a class trip. It was like a visit, and they were all Native American students from a nearby area. And they were all part of a special program that Arizona State was doing to make sure that, obviously Native American students are a big part of the population in Arizona. And and they were all, the kids were so excited to be there. And it was like, I just remember like, this is really cool. I just was like watching them interact with each other. They were wearing their ASU swag and everything. And I just remember thinking, and that was not something that someone even talked to me about in my talking to 50,000 things, everyone was telling me how great ASU was that day. That was not something that had come up, but I just remember thinking, it's like, this is one of the quiet things. Yes, ASU does quiet things. This is one of the quiet things ASU is doing right now to make sure it's serving its population. I really hope that kind of program doesn't get disappeared in this process.
Yeah.
Super important. America is a diverse nation. And our educational system has not yet figured out a way to make sure that we're offering educational opportunity to all our populations. And I know the secretary said today we shouldn't be enforcing discrimination, and I agree with her. At the same time, I think if we don't acknowledge what the disparities that already exist and the need to respond to those disparities, then we are in effect discriminating. So I guess I take a lot of issue with her definitions of discrimination.
Yeah.
So.
Well, so, this is an opportunity for me to talk about ASU because, in fact, for a long time now, we have been a university that is centered on inclusion. I mean, that's in our charter. You probably could recite our charter at this point, right? We measure
ourselves by who we admit, by not
exactly.
Yeah.
But what that means is we've always opened our door widely and accepted everybody. So we're not excluding people. Any people, if they're prepared to study, they've got a place at our institution. And so we will continue to do all of the programs we've always done before because we've always done it with that broad, inclusive framework. It hasn't been discriminatory. It hasn't been excluding anybody. You bring people from all communities to visit the campus, and we provide opportunities for all students. So we will continue to do that. It becomes more and more important for us to do that. And I think that more universities need to figure out a way to truly approach what they're doing in an inclusive way so that if everybody feels welcome, the population will define itself and will be represented in our institutions if we're truly operating in that way.
I think
it's been incumbent upon us to be much more innovative than we have in the past to achieve that goal.
Yeah, and it's like vitally important. I just like all the research in the last several years about the power of belonging, and belonging makes such a big difference for students on campuses. It's one of the key retention strategies that higher education has developed over the years. And belonging sometimes means, not to the exclusion of other people, but belonging means sometimes being able to see people who look like you on your campus, or who pray like you, or who come from the same kind of rural town that you came from. And those are, I know there's a real danger in identity politics, but there's also real value in identity. Let's go. There's real value in identity. Having people understand see their identities on campus matters.
I agree, and I do think part of the communicating that we need to do is to communicate in ways that all those communities hear what we're saying and believe they can be part of it. And I don't think that as a sector we've always been very good at doing that.
One of the last stories I got to write for the Chronicle, and actually I don't brag about my stories that much, but I would love if people get the chance to read this one, was about my own alma mater, Colgate, where one of the wealthiest donors to our school recently was donating a building, and he was going to name it after his family name, which is Benton. But having watched a lot of the campus protests and watching a lot of rich guys pull money out of Penn and some of the other schools this year, this rich guy at Colgate decided he was going to name the building Bernstein Hall, which was his original family name before his grandparents changed it. And I wrote about this experience and why he was doing it in the context of what was going on right now with campuses, but I also wrote about the context of my own family and my own experience going to that college as a Jewish student, going to a first-generation Jewish student. I should say both of my parents were Holocaust survivors, so when I came to college, I was coming to and I went to this little preppy college, felt very distant from it, didn't really understand it, and going back 45 years later and suddenly seeing there's a Bernstein Hall on my campus, it meant so much to me in a way that I just was remembering back to how my father was nervous when I went to the school, and I just reflected a little bit about that. And so that's where I want to get to this identity thing. It's not just identity, it matters. And to Dan Benton's credit, he understood that too. So.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I also am a first-generation student, and it always mattered to me seeing people like me, and it took me, I think, until graduate school until I really actually saw true leaders who looked like me and provided that role model. So, I don't see, certainly at ASU, us slowing down in our ability to attract and include everybody, and I just urge all of us to not give up on that agenda. And I know as we think about what's happening, I have faith that science is going to continue. We will continue to be a powerhouse in science, that, at the end of the day, we're going to figure out ways to make sure that we're part of the national powerhouse and contributing to the national interests and advancing our science, because we need it. But I think there are certain topics like DEI that are a little bit more at threat of being sidelined, and we just sort of can't make the goals of what we're trying to all achieve around inclusion be sidelined at the same time. I mean, it's a big lift, and you're right. You say, I don't know how you're going to do it, but I think it's really incumbent upon us to figure out how we do advance in a way that, is consistent with what the Secretary of Education said today, but that also includes our values and our communities so that people can see higher education as a place for them.
I really admire the work of a gentleman named Ibu Patel, who runs Interfaith America. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. I encourage you to become familiar with it. One of the things he's actually come around a little bit. He's actually been saying in the last year or two that he thinks whatever the DEI movement was, he thinks it kind of got a little bit off the rails, not with its mission, but kind of with some of its language primarily. And he talks about, and I kind of agree with him, but one thing he says that I find is so powerful, that is just, America is a pluralistic democracy, and that means, and he thinks colleges could do very well if they just make their mission preparing graduates to live and work in a pluralistic democracy. And so if you start with that, I wish I was clever enough to have come up with that. I think that's such a beautiful frame, because I feel like, I don't know how you argue with that goal, and then you say, okay, that's our goal. So we're just doing this in advance of that mission. And that means respecting differences, teaching about differences, and but also acknowledging them,
You know, Goldie, I mentioned this before just the other night, but I've been talking to Dean Chang, who leads innovation at the University of Maryland, College Park. And I was talking to him a little bit about, at this moment, how the Chronicle covers the Trump administration, how we're running very fast to cover it. And he reminded me, don't forget the reason why our readers get up in the morning is to serve students, what inspires them a little bit. And I want to ask you, based on the years of reporting you have, what have you seen that has inspired you in terms of what higher education does? And I think a little bit about the intro to your book, American Higher Education in Crisis, ? You may take the question mark away in some ways. This was written a number of years ago, obviously, but I'm just kind of curious about what is it that you've seen. You've mentioned the indigenous students at ASU. You've mentioned Eboo Patel and how he talks about higher education. I'm just kind of curious for this audience as we talk about these really difficult things, what is something that also reaffirms that you've seen, you've witnessed, you've talked to, who you've talked to, that reaffirms what the base mission of higher education?
This is actually, it's interesting that you said that, because there's a example I use in the beginning of the book of the student that I met at Cal State University. I think about this guy all the time. I'm blanking on his name at the moment, but he grew up in Stockton, and he was in the student government at Cal State, and he had gone on an internship in Washington for a few months through his college program, and he got a chance to be, he said he met other interns there who were like the rich kids, and their daddies knew people who were members of Congress or had connections. He had no connections, but it basically changed his life, and he went back and worked for the very charismatic young mayor of Stockton and became kind of a public service. I've Googled this guy a couple times in the past 10 years to see where he is, and he's still working in public service and public health. And I think about, that's what American higher education does at a good regional public university. It gives these, when it's working great. It doesn't always work great, and don't want to be here seen as an apologist for all the things that go wrong in higher ed, because there are plenty. And I spent a lot of my 36 years writing about what's wrong with them. But when I think back at that kid all the time, Chris, well, I think his name was Chris. I'm blanking on the name right now. Where else does that happen? I mean, so that's what's important, and it literally changed the trajectory of this young man's life. Just his experience in student government at Cal State, and then his experience being an intern in Washington. By the way, I've always thought that after January 6th, I was so stunned by everything in January 6th, and I had gone on these high school trips to Washington, D.C., and I kind of feel like America should have like a required field trip for everybody in high school, either to the Washington or to their state capital, so people could sort of understand what does government do? I couldn't imagine anyone from my high school field trip coming back to the Congress to do what those people did. So I just wondered if there's some way to teach a little reverence about that, some civic understanding.
Yeah, I think that's actually an important goal, and you might think that some people are going to be turned off from trying to step in as be part of civic leadership, and I think we need to make sure that we're...
I just saw that the law school applications are going up, which to me, I think that's something about what's happening right now. I think people fundamentally still do believe in the power of the rule of law. I think they understand that it's important, so that was somewhat encouraging to me.
Good. So you've interviewed many leaders in higher education across your years, and we're coming up on running out of time here a little bit. What advice do you have for today's leaders?
Think back about why you became a higher education leader. And I think, first of all, rely on that, number one, because I know you didn't necessarily get into it for the money. I mean, you got into it because you care about students, you care about truth, you care about free inquiry, you care about the country, I think. So I think just lean into some of that. So that's sort of on the idealistic side. And then I guess more on the practical side, going back to my expansionist thing here, higher ed's going to require a new kind of leadership in the next several years, politics aside, but with politics maybe even more so. Collaboration is going to be all the more important. Allyship, all those things that higher ed leaders have never been very good at because they're all competing with each other day in and day out, competing for students. And I think you have to sort of see yourselves more, it's not a system, but it is a sector, and I think maybe you have to think more about where you fit into the broader spectrum and think about So like lean into the mission, as vague as those words always are, but also think a lot about who your allies are in the sector and also who your allies are beyond the sector. It is an engine of economic opportunity. It is an engine of civic connection. Those are the connections that you're going to have to make and use.
We are about to run out of time, and I have to say that Goldie has to get to another panel right after this, so she's going to be bolting off the stage to get someplace else.
But I'll be around later.
Yes. But I do want to thank her. Please let's thank Goldie for all her years covering higher education. Also thank Provost Gonzales for suggesting that we do this and flipping the script. I really appreciate that as well. Thank you both.